Welcome everyone to the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research Think and Drink series of virtual talks. We hope you are all as well and healthy as you could possibly be given the state of the world. I'm Scott Henkel. I'm the director of the Wyoming Institute for Humanities Research. And the title of tonight's conversation is A Historical Perspective on Politics in Times of Crisis. On this one, I'll just say I am ever so happy that our recent conversations have been keenly attuned to the state of the world in which we live. And here in Wyoming, our legislature is about ready to go into special session to decide what is to be done about the world in which we live. So I know that our panelists have wisdom to share, and I hope that elected officials everywhere will learn from the wisdom that we're going to hear tonight. In just a moment, I will introduce tonight's moderator, but a couple of technical details first. If anyone listening wants to type a question to the panelists, you can come right down here and you have a Q&A box. And if you type a question into the Q&A box, it will come just to the panelists. Also down here, there is a chat function, and anyone attending can choose either to send a chat just to the panelists or also to send a message or question to anyone who is with us this evening. So you may choose what to do if you wish to communicate with us. If you come up over here, there is a button that either says speaker view or gallery view. You can click that button if you want to see just one speaker at a time. You go to speaker view. But if you want to have the like Hollywood Squares, Brady Bunch, you know, whatever, you can press gallery view and then see everyone at the same time. Okay, after this week, we're going to move because this is the end of our semester and summer is starting. We're going to move to the Think and Drinks every other week. So come please join us 2 weeks from tonight. Okay. I am thrilled to introduce to you Dr. Ken Gerow, Professor of Statistics, who will be tonight's moderator, who will introduce our panelists. So please, welcome.
Hi, Scott. So we have with us today a wonderful panel of 3 historians who I will now introduce. All 3 study different aspects of European history, Germany in particular. And I'm going to emphasize differences in their interests because it's the convergence of those different interests that will enrich in this conversation. Kathryn Julian, a current book project of Dr. Kathryn Julian, explores Catholic religious orders and sacred space in socialist Central Europe. Currently on the faculty of Maryville College, that's in Tennessee, correct? This summer, she will be moving to Westminster College in Salt Lake City. So she's going to be in the Rocky Mountain region by fall. And a little ahead of time, we'll say welcome on behalf of those of us in this part of the country. Adam Blackler is on the faculty at the University of Wyoming. And remind me where that is?
I forget. You're going to have to remind me, Ken.
I'm pretty sure it's in Laramie, but I haven't seen the campus for a few weeks, so I'm not sure. He's an active publisher in studies of aspects of German colonialism, race, and genocide. His most recent book project, A Cultural History of Genocide, is scheduled to release this fall. And then from the middle of the continent, more or less, another windy neighborhood, Northwestern University's in Chicago, Northwestern University's Dr. Lauren Stokes has special interests in guest workers and refugees and migration, among other things. A current book bears the tentative title, Fear of the Family, Guest Workers and Family Migration in West Germany. So their focal point of their studies as historians is Europe, Germany in particular, but today they're going to be drawing on that knowledge, that learning to bring the current moment, including our lives, into the conversation. So it's not going to be all about Europe. Kathryn, Adam, and Lauren, I welcome and I thank you for taking the time to be part of this conversation. Let's start with brief opening remarks. I didn't decide who might go first. And then I'll try to stump you with questions.
Okay. Perfect.
Kathryn.
Okay, yes, I'll start. So I'm Kathryn. As Ken mentioned, I research communities, religious communities and socialist societies, but my interests are very broad, which will be great for our conversation tonight. And I teach at liberal arts colleges, so I teach very broadly as well. I'm really interested in global truth and reconciliation commissions, post-conflict memory cultures. I'm working on kind of a second project right now about the ecology of pilgrimage sites in Central Europe and East Asia, venturing out a little bit. And today I'm going to be talking a lot, or hopefully having a conversation with all of you about how historical memory in particular is tied to present day politics in places like Central and Eastern Europe, especially in moments of crisis. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot since I lived in Hungary in 2007. And we see how all of that's kind of culminated this year with COVID-19 in Hungary. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, Kathryn. Lauren?
Sure, thank you. I'm Lauren Stokes. Thank you so much for the invitation. And so my main interest is really in the history of migration. And so I'll say something about how I got interested in the topic of crisis in particular. So a few years ago now, in 2015, there was the big European refugee crisis, or migrant crisis, variously called. And this was happening, as it so happened, as I was finishing my dissertation on immigration policy in German history. And I was really struck by the fact that politicians seem to be saying, this is a new crisis, this is an unprecedented crisis. And I felt like I had spent the last 6 years reading all of their statements for the previous 50 years. And if I was like a robot, I could have created the text that they were saying in that day. I felt like they were just repeating the same scripts that they had been saying about migration for decades. And so I became really interested in thinking about what a crisis is and how we understand crises historically, particularly in relationship to migration. But I think more broadly in terms of what does the script of crisis do for political possibilities? And so that's what I'm looking forward to talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam?
Thank you, Ken. And I want to extend my sincere thanks to both Professors Julian and Stokes for joining us. Great colleagues, great friends, and I'm really glad this was able to happen for all of us to come together. I'll speak very briefly. As you mentioned in your introduction, I'm a historian primarily of colonialism, of race, of nationalism, related to Germany in primarily a context of empire. A book that I'm finishing this month, and everyone has to hold me to that, the manuscript at least, focuses specifically on German Southwest Africa, which is the present day state of Namibia, and Germany's long and very violent history in that space. Certainly a topic for another time, perhaps. And while that subject, broadly speaking, would certainly be applicable to our conversation this afternoon or evening, depending on where we are, I actually am hoping to kind of dovetail the previous two comments. I'm hoping to talk about something that I am interested in from a potential for research, but something I've been teaching a lot about the last couple of years, and that is specifically the history of Weimar Germany. Weimar is everywhere in some ways, and including for those that are not German history fanatics like a lot of us. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think some positive and some negative. If no one knows anything about Weimar, one thing they may know is that it was the political experience in Germany that eventually gave way to the Nazis. And if we're talking about politics in crisis, I'd be hard pressed to find another example, at least historically speaking, that would be applicable to this conversation. So I look forward to having that conversation and learning a whole bunch. So thank you.
Well, thanks. I'll start with a question. I'm going to try to take off from some of your introductory remarks, but maybe not fully, but we will get there. And I don't have any particular order of speakerness. So when I pose a question, whoever wants to jump in, and I'll sit back and listen to the three of you until it looks like you're running out of ideas on that question. So in this spring, in March of this year, Hungarian Prime Minister Orbán now has the authority to rule indefinitely by decree. There are certainly people in this country who are concerned about a similar unfolding or potential for a similar unfolding phenomena. Is that erosion of democracy particular to Hungary and Central Europe? Is it part of a broader phenomenon? And how is it related to, or how is the activation of that related to our current crisis? I'll say coronavirus primarily.
Yeah, that's a great question, Ken. I'll jump in on that one to start off, because I think this has been a long process in Hungary. COVID-19 has really highlighted a long erosion of democracy that started much earlier. Even when I taught English there in 2007, and even when I was there then, I noticed the rise of the right wing already, kind of some right wing militia groups that I saw in the town I taught in. And this shows how quickly this type of thing can escalate in a country too. So no one's quite safe from this kind of populism and the rise of the right wing. And so 2008 economic crisis was the first time when the Hungarian right wing conservatives, the Fidesz party is the party that Orbán is in, began to really consolidate power and attracted a lot of people to their message. And so that first crisis, the first economic crisis, 2008, the recession, began even more of this kind of process toward authoritarianism. Since Fidesz and Orbán have been elected, there has been an erosion of the public sphere, kind of an attack on higher education, the Academy of Sciences, an attack on journalists. The ruling party in Hungary now controls something like 90% of media outlets. So there's really only one message getting out. So this is looked particular in Hungary to some extent, and I'll talk maybe later about how historical memory has really played into the Hungarian case and maybe kind of society's understanding of their own history. And Orbán has clearly capitalized on that. But I think to your question that this really is this kind of democracy in danger. This is a crisis all over the world. And I think that we're going to see more of that with coronavirus, or more kind of these strongmen leaders aspiring to do what Orbán has done. And you kind of mentioned this, but so what was passed on March 30th was the coronavirus law. And this removed any checks on Orbán's power. And it allows his government to regulate issues by government decree, as long as it can make the argument that the issue that it's regulating is somehow tangentially related to the coronavirus. The idea is that, well, we don't have time for democratic parliamentarian debate about this. We've got to make a decision about public health. But right now, it kind of appears that these decrees are only narrowly related to public health. He's been able to take money away from political opponents to give as part of a stimulus, some things like that, controlling media, threatening to jail journalists who circulate fake news. And I think we hear some of that as well. And experts are, and this is going to also sound familiar to us in the United States, experts and human rights activists are very concerned that the Orbán government could start jailing disease experts or whistleblowers who highlight that they haven't done enough with the coronavirus. Orbán also dismantled a pandemic team in 2017. So we clearly see some overlap. I know, like in Brazil, also you see a strongman, Bolsonaro, who's trying to emulate some of this too. So you too can also weigh in on this.
Sounds like a really simple and elegant way to get things done. Sign me up.
Right. What could go wrong?
Yeah, what could go wrong? Adam or Lauren want to jump in?
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Kathryn. I am in full agreement, and I think my way of answering this question, and again in the context of Weimar specifically, and related to your question, this is not unique to our present day period in time, and it is not unique to places like Germany or places like Hungary or Brazil, places that might not have as long of a history of liberal democracy as places like, for instance, France or the United States or elsewhere. And I think that's something to be very cognizant of. And in the context of Weimar, I think if there's one lesson I always try and convey to my students, it's that Weimar was not doomed to inevitable failure. It absolutely was not. It had immense potential. And this is not some romanticized perception of my own in 2020. This is absolute fact. If you really look at the state of affairs, politically, economically, socially, and otherwise, during that 14-year period of time. And I should mention, just in case, for those that in the audience that might not know, Weimar Germany is approximately the period in German history from the end of the First World War until the appointment of Adolf Hitler in January of 1933. So about a 14-year period of time. And I think it's vital that we understand that, because if Weimar, again, oftentimes is talked about at all, it's usually in this very passive way where it was doomed to failure, when it was an actual active destruction that took place. And if we understand that and accept that reality, and something I'd be happy to talk about in more detail as we go forward, we then have to ask ourselves, how was that possible, and what were those, and what are some potential lessons that we could learn about and take away from that experience in the present day? And again, happy to discuss this in more detail later on, but I think that's the main crux to your question and the historical links between them.
Great. I'll actually take this in a slightly different direction, but something both Kathryn and Adam said made me think about 1945 in Germany. Nazi Germany had been defeated. The Allies came in. They said, the number one thing we have to do is make sure that there will never be another Hitler in Germany, right? That Germany will never become a dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship again. And so in West Germany, which was the part of Germany that was occupied by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, one of the ways that they really wanted to do this was to institute federalism, so that there would be a lot of authority devolved to the smaller parts of Germany. The person sitting in the president's seat in the capital wouldn't have all the power to give emergency decrees and to say, I decide what media gets to go out to the public. All of the individual little states in Germany have a lot of power in terms of determining their own media and their own policies. And I've been thinking a lot about federalism in the context of the COVID crisis. Contemporary Germany still has a lot of federal aspects. And of course, the United States has a lot of federal aspects. And looking at COVID, our federalism has led to some chaos, right? There have been reports of, let's say, Donald Trump and the federal government intercepting shipments of PPE protection for healthcare workers that individual governors have gotten for their states. But it also means that individual governors and legislatures have been able to make the decisions they feel are best for their own people, right? That Trump and the executive branch have not yet been able to overrule and say, Governor Pritzker, who's my governor here in Illinois, you can't have a stay-at-home order. And as you said, kind of the Wyoming legislature is meeting tomorrow to decide what to do. And it's federalism that kind of makes that possible. So it's interesting to think about how the kind of lesson, that federalist lesson we drew from Nazi Germany, how is that playing out today? Is it actually good for democracy? I don't know a lot about whether Hungary had federal institutions prior to Orban. In terms of the question of whether this is like a global democratic crisis, I think it's interesting too to think about how all of these kind of strong men, we think of them as very nationalistic, correctly, right? They talk about making America great again, or Hungary being having to recover its former glory, or in Brazil or Turkey, similar stories. But they also all look at what the others do. They kind of emulate other strong men and other nationalist movements around the world. And so I think it's really useful to think about how, even though they're deeply nationalistic maybe, and talk about wanting to pull back from the international order, they get influenced by looking at people like Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump, arguably, to some sense here. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. And I to speak to that, I mean, I think a lot of these strong men, despite the fact, like you're saying, Lauren, they're so nationalistic, they're also in communication with each other, in maybe not in a personal way all the time, but just like praising each other randomly, just kind of name dropping. So one of my students this past semester came across a video of Orban and Chuck Norris talking. I'm not entirely sure why Chuck Norris was in Hungary. It seems about right, whatever, weird politics going on. But he's like riding around in his car with Orban, and they're talking about how hard all of like these great men leaders have it. And, you know, Orban's trying to kind of style himself as like, I'm from like a working class, like I'm a scrapper. He's from like a middle class family in Székesfehérvár in Hungary. But anyway, he's in this video, they're both kind of like praising Trump, like, oh yeah, the liberals criticize me. And Orban has made it his campaign to style Hungary as an illiberal democracy. He sees himself not necessarily going back, but this kind of bizarre, not progressive, but like he's the wave of the future. This illiberal democracy is the new model that's going to be successful in Europe. But the reality of it is, right, that illiberal democracies are not democracies. Adam, I'm sure you know this with Weimar into Nazism, that illiberal political movements typically become authoritarianism. And I think that's what we're seeing in Hungary and maybe some other places as well, that this crisis atmosphere has really just stripped away the veneer of democracy.
It's good. All three of you spoke to and used different words, but dictatorships didn't quite get mentioned directly, but it could have. Authoritarian, strong man. And currently, you all spoke to, and it's part of our current lexicon, I guess, to think of that authoritarianism, that strongman approach to the world coming from, quote unquote, the political right. But historically, and I think this is okay to ask because I'm speaking to three historians, that authoritarianism has sometimes been an aspect of both the left and the right, or the right. Can you help? It's not a right-wing phenomenon purely, and I can't say I understand that at all. And so I'd be glad to hear if you guys could elucidate and educate me.
I'm happy to jump in briefly, just to, again, with respect to Weimar, while of course the Nazis are, and without question, and don't let any other media personality say otherwise, Nazism is an extreme ultra-right movement. Initially in Weimar's beginning, it was the fear of ultra-left forms of totalitarianism that really, in many respects, I would say, was one of the defining crises that the lingering crises that in many respects really plague the regime, or I should say the Republic for the 14 years it was in existence. And in particular, it was because of this looming threat of the Soviet Union. And I think it's something that oftentimes, at least in the United States, sometimes is forgotten during that immediate period, the 1920s, early 1930s, is that the global specter in the world at that time, for the most part, was the Soviet Union. The United States doesn't recognize the Soviet Union politically until 1933. So this is not something that we immediately think of the Nazis again in this time period. It was not something that we should dismiss lightly. And some specific examples, right as Weimar started to found, or right as politicians started to found Weimar in January and February of 1919, something called the Spartacus Aufstand, the so-called Spartacus Uprising, kind of erupted throughout much of Germany, primarily in cities. For a period of time, Munich and Bavaria seceded from Germany and declared itself a Soviet in the hopes of linking up with Trotsky's Red Army. That memory lingered, and I think it had a big impact on a permanent fear of the ultra left that then over time certainly did not make the rise of an extreme right inevitable, but it made it more, I think it made, the possibility was there because it was more familiar than something like the Soviet Union. So in this historical context, I think it's absolutely a part of both political spectrums, if we want to call it that.
Yeah, I can speak really briefly to totalitarianism, and I'd be curious to hear Kathryn on this as well, because I know you study state socialism, so I'm sure you have a few things to say about totalitarianism. But yeah, from my understanding of the kind of term, it really first comes into popular use in the late 1940s and early 1950s as a way to kind of put together fascist regimes like the ones that had just been defeated in World War II, Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, arguably Japan, with this new Cold War threat of the Soviet Union. And so to bring together kind of these right and left wing instantiations of what a state should look like. Again, to go back to something I said earlier, both of these are characterized by pretty deep centralization and by an attempt to kind of control more aspects of life than we expect in a democratic regime. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear Kathryn talk about this, because I know you probably know the most about any of us about state socialism. So.
Well, I don't know if I would go that far that I know the most, but yeah, I mean, obviously the people I study are living in those systems of socialism, so they certainly don't characterize them as totalitarian at all. But like Lauren has just said, it is kind of this term that's used by opponents of communism during the Cold War to compare it to fascist totalitarianism or other forms of some sort of authoritarian government. And what's interesting is I think that to go back to Hungary's current political situation, I think that Orban would use that comparison. He started Fidesz, this party, in 1988 as an opposition party to communism in Hungary. And so they always kind of framed themselves against the communists, but also against the Nazis, against fascism. And that's part of Hungary's memory culture too, is this opposition to both forms of totalitarianism. They were the victims of totalitarianism. And I'm not sure that term gets bandied about a lot in public use or with people a lot, but certainly I still hear scholars using that term. And I know it's kind of a fraught term now, but absolutely, yeah.
So this question is a clarification one, I suppose. It's an aside to some extent, but several of you have used the term historical memory. And so what does that mean? How long does it last? And for example, in our current medically oriented crisis, my question would be, oh, and by the way, that previous question came from the audience, and I'm currently riffing on audience questions now too, just so you know. Did the Spanish flu from 100 years ago, is that part of our historical memory now in terms of how we're responding, or is it too far back? I mean, at this moment, for example, there are people who know people who were somehow alive during the Civil War, and that kind of concept of time just doesn't register with any of us. Like, that was so long ago, it doesn't exist in real time. So historical memory, what is it? How long does it last? And specifically, in the case of our current moment, do we still have some residual cultural memories from the Spanish flu, which any of us have only just read about?
Oh gosh,
I
I don't
stumped
know
them.
that
I stumped them.
you did. I don't know that I can you, Lauren, Adam, feel free to add on, because I don't know that I'm going to be good at defining what historical memory is. But I kind of think of it as the way we as a society, maybe in our literature, in our films, media, memoirs, social media now, how we remember historical events, and especially crises like the Spanish influenza, the influenza of 1918, which, you know, I'm not sure that that really entered into the historical kind of public consciousness until, or at least I didn't hear a lot about it in the public discourse until we had COVID-19, and then suddenly it's become a lot more important. The pandemic that my students love anyway is the Black Death. They love talking about the bubonic plague as kind of this moment of Western cultural memory. I don't know, but I think it all depends on the society you belong to, what your religious identity, your racial identity is, what is going to stand out in your cultural memory. So, I mean, for not to go down a rabbit hole here, but like for Hungary's current crisis and this erosion of democracy that we've been talking about, I think the memories, the public, the way the public remembers Hungarian history in Hungary, the way they're taught it in schools, has really contributed to the rise of Orban as kind of a strongman leader. And that has to do with a lot with the victimhood narrative in Hungary that you could say starts with 1526 maybe, and the Battle of Mohacs when the Ottomans invade Hungary. And then after that, they had kind of this like pure form, this Hungarian leadership up until then, their own autonomous kingdom. And then after the Ottoman occupation, you have the Habsburgs. And then after that, you know, you have Austria-Hungary, 1848 failed nationalist revolution. The Habsburgs put that down as well with help from the Russian Empire. And then you have the First World War and the Treaty of Trianon, which Hungarians talk about all the time. I mean, when I lived there, I'll talk about that in a second. But when I lived there, I taught English, and the first thing my 15-year-old students did was draw the Empire of Hungary on the board in chalk. They were really good at it too, actually. And then they showed me all of the areas that Hungary lost after the First World War with this treaty that was part of the Paris Peace Conference, ending the First World War. And they said, this should be Hungary. So it's this nationalist narrative of memory, of historical memory, but it's also of us being victims and wanting to restore something. And then of course that they were victims of the Nazis too in World War II. And so it kind of absolves them from having to deal with any kind of memory of being perpetrators or sending Jews to Auschwitz. Well, that was just the Nazis that did that. We were victims just like the Jews were. Forget that Hungarians sent Jews or collaborated or tracked them into the Danube. But yeah, go ahead. You guys jump in on this. I could go on.
Yeah, I'm spitballing here because I haven't thought about this that much before this question was asked. But when I think about 1918 and world history and in German history, I think about, before a month ago, I thought about the end of World War I. And then in Germany, I thought about a German revolution that gave way to a democratic government in Germany, which is the Weimar Republic that Adam has talked about. And I never thought about the Spanish flu. And so I don't know whether those other events kind of have overwritten cultural memory. You know, I've certainly watched more movies that somehow touched on World War I than I have about the hospitals that were treating Spanish flu. And that's an interesting thought experiment. Like, in 10 years, are we going to have a COVID movie, and like, what will it look like? my house is not going to be a very interesting location for that, but you can imagine a movie that focused on the first responders or something like that. In terms of historical memory then, and this kind of goes back to something Kathryn said, I wonder if one of the reasons that the Spanish flu was difficult to remember is because it is kind of hard to, some of the stories that are most powerful in historical memory have kind of enemies. They have binaries, they have kind of victims and victors, losers and winners, and it's hard to know what to blame when the real enemy is, you know, invisible. And yeah, so I wonder about whether that's a reason that the Spanish flu hasn't been as more in our historical memory. I'm curious, Adam, whether you think that the Spanish flu impacted Weimar in ways that we are now going to recognize looking back at history with these fresh eyes, where we all know how much a pandemic can upend our lives.
That's actually exactly what I was going to say, and I come in with the same statement that in some ways both of you had mentioned. I actually don't know right now, and I'm sure it exists, but I don't know of any scholarship that actually details Weimar Germany, Germany in the 1920s, Germany in the 1930s, its response, its reaction to the Spanish flu. Which incidentally, I think it's always important to talk about. The only reason it has the name Spanish flu is because Spain was one of the only countries, if not the only country at that time, to actually report accurate numbers. Best estimates suggest that it actually started in Kansas. And so I think it's important to understand how names can actually, and labels can actually have really powerful impacts societally and also historically. And the reason I make that one point in particular is, and to link it to Lauren's question, or statement, is not just to pronounce trivia, but my hunch is if anybody in Weimar Germany on the left or primarily the political right talked about it, it was within the same context of fearing the other. The other brings disease. The other brings elements that are foreign to Germany that we are rightfully supposed to be afraid of. We are a young republic, or we are a disenfranchised monarchy, depending on what side of the spectrum one might be on. Either way, the quote unquote other is a problem. And I suspect, as Lauren suggested, I do think that there are going to be some very interesting studies that emerge within the next 5 or 10 years that investigate this period with a new perspective. And not to belabor the point, but just to add my 2 cents on collective memory. I don't know if there is a specific date to how long it can have an impact in either a society or historically. But what I'm about to say with respect to Weimar's, the memory of Weimar in Germany and how it plays out today, this is somewhat a gross generalization, but in my years and over the last years of living in Germany and spending time there, some of the main differences socially and collectively that I see between Germany and the United States, often in many respects have to do with memory of Weimar. There is a general, not fear, but hesitance to go into debt. The use of credit cards are only something that really, I mean, you guys, both of you, correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I remember when I was doing my dissertation research only 10 years ago, not even, it was very hard to pay with a card, a debit card. And that had to do with this memory of the Great Depression and the crisis that befell upon Germany, leading to the rise of the Nazis. So there was this sense of being very fiscally responsible, and that will prevent something like that from happening again. We don't see the German flag as displayed prominently, informally or formally, as much as you would see in the United States, because there's this fear of nationalism. They don't see it as a patriotic move outside of course, World Cup. But outside of that venue, there's hesitation of demonstrating that kind of thing. And again, these are some generalizations, but I think that in public venues, that's one impact that we absolutely can see collective memory from that period still having an impact today.
If I can,
go ahead, Lauren.
Yeah, I'll just jump quickly because
Great.
Adam made me think of something. We do know very well that anti-Semitic tropes and other tropes of demonizing the other under fascism in Nazi Germany often focused on like, these people are bringers of disease, and kind of saw them as an inherently sick and disease bringing population based on no reality. But I wonder if those tropes had a particular impact because of recent memories of the Spanish flu. This is a speculation, but it's very true that anti-Semitism often links Jewish people to disease, that anti-Roma and Sinti sentiment similarly linked those populations to the disease. I mean, again, to just look at today, the kind of our administration's attempt to kind of call it China flu is this, yeah, as Adam said, it's called Spanish flu because Spain was the only place with a free press at the time. Right now, China does not have a free press, but calling it China flu links it to Asians and Asian Americans and people of Asian descent in a way that has led to, you know, unjustified hate crimes against that community. And so COVID-19, you know, the coronavirus, we shouldn't make the mistake of calling it the Spanish flu again, actually, I guess is one way to put that. Kathryn?
Yeah, I was going to comment on something else, but now you mentioned the Roma, and that seems so much more urgent, especially with what's going on in Eastern Europe and Central Europe in places like Hungary. So the Roma, or gypsies as they're called in Hungary and other places, are some of Europe's most marginalized people, and they often live in very overcrowded settlements or housing on the outskirts of villages. Sometimes they don't have access to running water. And there's this idea that they're the other. I mean, we saw that with Holocaust. You know, I mean, they were one of the largest victim groups of the Holocaust and just throughout European history. And so as in other crises, and especially with diseases, I think that Roma are being targeted during the coronavirus. And we don't have all of the information about that because governments like Bulgaria and other places are not just offering up like, look at how we're treating the Roma people right now. But in Hungary, this has also been a very racialized thing with the coronavirus. And I know that some Roma communities have been kind of cordoned off with checkpoints. And the justification is that these people are kind of dirty, they're not sanitary, and we're stopping the spread of the virus to our normal population. And I've actually heard some of that rhetoric in the United States, which is pretty alarming. I can't remember if it was, it was a court case that I was kind of, briefly reading through in Iowa. And one of the judges said something about like, oh, well, those numbers of the coronavirus that skyrocketed yesterday was because they tested a meat packing plant where, of course, like 80% of the workers were Latino. And she actually said, like, those weren't normal people, or those weren't our normal citizens. And I don't know if she meant it to be malicious in that way, but you hear that kind of same rhetoric, the othering during disease periods like this.
So one of the aspects of your comments now about the memory thing made me brings to my mind that the memory may not be literal. For example, an audience person mentioned the comment that the Spanish flu, he's never read anything about it. It's the literal memory of it is not part of our current. Well, we're bringing it back now because of the coronavirus, but it's also the case that I think the book I'm thinking of is Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, that there are pockets of this country where in different parts of this country, immigrants typically came from certain regions of Europe or wherever, and they brought their cultural habits with them, brought from generations of life there, and those cultural habits maintain themselves 3 or 4 or 5 generations later with no reason whatsoever, meaning no memory for why they originated in the first place. So I think it's possible that some of this cultural memory historical memory is embodied in just cultural manifestations that we're not even aware of.
Yeah. Ken, if I can pick up on that point, I actually was talking to a colleague recently who works on Chinese history, and she pointed out that the first outbreak globally that was stopped with masks was in China. It was a plague outbreak in late 19th century China. And so similarly, you know, maybe the reason that mask wearing has been more prevalent in China and in Asian countries, East Asian countries, has been something about this kind of deep historical memory, because they were actually the first people to successfully prevent an outbreak or, you know, calm down an outbreak of a disease with the use of masks.
Interesting.
So a good innovation. Everybody wear your mask when you have to.
Right. So here's a question that arose from the audience. Hannah Arendet has pointed out that the rise of totalitarianism is sometimes driven by a couple of things in tandem. One is making science unreal, and repeating lies until they get believed. And boy, does that sound familiar. Does that work, I mean, in your historical studies, Weimar or other aspects of, do those two things ring a bell?
I hate to say it, 100%. There are numerous examples that I know both Kathryn and Lauren could talk about in the case of Weimar. I'm going to point to one. By no means is this the only, but arguably the most infamous, at least in the early period, but it lasts throughout, is something referred to as the stab in the back legend, the Dockstoßlegende, as it was called in German. And I'm sure many in the audience are familiar with the phrase stab in the back. This is not some cute little statement about whatever. This is a virulent anti-Semitic argument that in some cases every political party, including those on the left, with the exception of the Communist Party, actually proliferated for a period of time, but later on, especially the extreme right. But the crux behind it was Jews and pacifists, but primarily Jews in the home front or on the home front during the First World War, stabbed the German army in the back by negotiating peace, or by ultimately surrendering and agreeing to the Diktat of Versailles, as it was referred to, when Germany was on the brink of a great military victory. And what gave this completely illogical, lacking any credibility whatsoever argument some justification in the eyes of many people was that in November of 1918, when the armistice was signed, the German army in all spheres was still fighting outside of what was pre-war World War I German borders. So the perception that they were winning in this offensive way was there. And there was also this lingering nonsensical argument that Jews did not do their fair share of the fighting, when actual reports and studies that the military conducted in 1916 and 1917 said the exact opposite. But nevertheless, it benefited in the eyes of the German military leadership. It this mentality and this myth benefited them, because if they didn't lose the war in the eyes of the German public, then they could shift blame to someone else and still keep their romantic image in the post-war period. So I think that is something that is prominent in the history of Weimar and has a major impact throughout the rest of the 14 years.
Yeah, so to bring that to present day too, in Hungary, there are kind of conspiracy theories that the government has now embraced as well. And they are anti-Semitic, surprise, surprise, in nature. And one was started by the Jobbik Party, which is the very far right fascist, neo-fascist party in Hungary. I think their whole title is Movement for a Better Hungary. And they encourage the idea that Jews have incited the Roma, the gypsy communities in Hungary, toward violence toward the Hungarian people, that these are kind of seen as outsiders. They can't be Hungarian. And it seems to me as a historian to be playing right into these kind of Weimar Nazi tropes, even though they're also saying that they're not connected to Nazism or to that period of, well, maybe the Jobbik do kind of embrace that period, but the government doesn't want to embrace that period. but it actually led to a law called the Soros law that banned George Soros's nonprofit in Hungary, which is, of course, Lauren, you can probably speak to this more, has to deal with the migrant crisis. Hungary became kind of this cautionary tale in Europe about how exclusive they were and how, or exclusionary and xenophobic they were when this refugee crisis came to Europe in 2015. They kept refugee and asylum seekers in really horrible conditions, and this is still playing out even now amid the coronavirus. So yeah, I think we do still see some of these kind of nationalist lies and conspiracy theories, and it's very scary when they become part of the dominant political culture.
Yeah, I'm sure I'm not the only person on this call who was very angry when Donald Trump suggested injecting yourself with bleach as a form of combating the coronavirus. I was extremely upset that the president had said something like this. And initially I was like, why would he say this? You know, that doesn't cure coronavirus. And I think then kind of stepping back from it, I had to think, like, as a speech act, Trump isn't saying inject yourself with bleach as a way to cure coronavirus. That's not his objective in suggesting that his followers drink bleach. His objective is to give you a sense that he's in control, to give you a sense that he knows what he's doing, to give you a sense that he's the leader who can get us out of this crisis. And so I think kind of thinking about these conspiracy theories, you can think, like, why would anyone say something like this? And I think that if we think about it as a speech act that's saying something different from actually this is how to cure coronavirus, that's actually saying I'm a good leader and I know more than other people do. If we think about it in that way, we kind of get to that. And as Adam and Kathryn have said, there's a lot of historical examples of this. And again, here we've seen conspiracy theories kind of pass globally, like the idea that coronavirus has something to do with 5G, or again, the underlying anti-Semitism to a lot of the coronavirus. I mean, I'm a professor of European history, and so one of the first emails I got about the coronavirus was a claim that George Soros had created it in a lab. And didn't I, a professor at a distinguished university, know this? Just kind of a deranged email. But George Soros has been linked to a lot of these things, and it is kind of an anti-Semitic trope. Yeah, George Soros's father survived the Holocaust, and his memoir is actually a very moving story of kind of where that leads, and it's, yeah, I don't know where to go from there.
Yeah,
for the record,
go
for the
ahead,
record,
sorry,
I did not send that email, Lauren. Just
I deleted it.
No, I was just going to say that for those who don't know, George Soros is Hungarian American descent, and like Lauren said, his father survived the Holocaust, and his writings have been banned in Hungary. And not only George Soros, who is, you know, anti-Semites all over the world kind of associate him with these weird global conspiracies. But it's not just George Soros. Orban just revamped the curriculum in Hungary, and they're no longer reading Imre Kertész, who is the only Nobel Peace Prize winner from Hungary. He wrote a book, I think in English it's Fatelessness, and it's about his experiences in the Holocaust. And so they're not reading that. They're kind of whitewashing that period of Hungarian history. They were the victims of that, you know. So it doesn't behoove them to talk about Jewish survivors. Yeah.
As we saw in the 9/11, I guess that was a crisis or a moment. It wasn't an unfolding crisis, but a traumatic moment for sure. It's easier for politicians to motivate citizens when there's a crisis in play. And certainly the coronavirus is a legitimate crisis. Could you talk a little bit maybe about created crises versus legitimate crises? How they get deployed by people who aspire to total control?
Sure, I know Adam will have something to say about this in Weimar, but I'll say something about just kind of how I have come to think about crises philosophically in terms of my research. As I said, when the refugee crisis happened in 2015, I felt like politicians were responding in the same way they had responded to every movement of immigrants for the last 60 years. I could trace just a straight line back. It didn't matter how many immigrants had come in that year. They would say very similar things. And so I came to think that kind of to elevate something to crisis is kind of to make a script around something that it's new, that we haven't seen something like this before. And to some extent that no one could have foreseen this and it came from outside, that it wasn't part of the system. And so that's certainly true of a lot of these crises. No one knew that planes were going to fly into the World Trade Center. No one could have precisely said that this little molecule would come and ravish people in the way that it does in these bizarre symptomatic things that we've seen. But if you look at the reporting, you can see that the Centers for Disease Control had warned at the end of 2019, if a pandemic happens, the United States is not prepared for it. And in fact, that they had been making this warning every year for over a decade at this point. And so I think sometimes what I mean to say here is that I think when the language of crisis is mobilized, it's important to say like, well, what in the system we already had also is contributing to this, so that we don't end up passing laws and making measures that just give power to politicians, but that actually change things so that this is less likely to happen in the future. I don't know if that quite answers the question, but I know I mentioned the crisis script that I think about. And so I think it's important to say, are we using the crisis script to just give Orban a lot of power to do whatever he wants? Or are we using the crisis script to say, hey, let's step back and think about how we can prepare better so that our hospitals and our social safety net will be better prepared if something like this happens again in the future. Yeah.
Adam is either nodding in vigorous agreement or nodding off. Adam?
The former, I promise. Yes, in all honesty. If I may piggyback on that exact point, two very brief things I will say, one legitimate and one not. I think one legitimate crisis that follows much of what Lauren just spoke of was the Great Depression. And I think that was a legitimate unfolding, sudden in the November 1929 aspect of it, but something that of course then continued in various ways for years, depending on where we're talking about. In the case of Germany, one must remember that this was its second massive economic depression in the same decade. All right, and I'm not saying it was unique even in that respect, but this was a seismic catastrophe. And if we talk about the playbook, if we were to use that phrase, in some respects, nothing in history is inevitable. In some respects, I think this really served as the beginning of the end in some ways, historically speaking, with the benefit of perspective, because this was the final issue, the final event that I think really led a lot of status quo political parties, middle of either side of the spectrum, to really lose the support of not everybody, not even a majority, but a considerable number of people who lost faith in the Republic. This cannot continue. This seemingly is something that is not going to sustain itself. And by that point, the defenders of the Republic were frankly exhausted. And I think that's something that's really important to think about. A manufactured crisis that, without question, was the final nail in the coffin, if you will, of Weimar. People out there may critique my periodization here a little bit, but after Adolf Hitler was chancellor, was proclaimed chancellor by Paul von Hindenburg, the president of the Republic, in January of 1933, excuse me, the next month, the so-called Reichstag fire occurs. And this is something that I think we're seeing more and more about in relation to COVID, where the fire was real, but who the Nazis said was responsible for it was not, absolutely not. And even if it was right, even if they were correct in who the arsonists were, their response was an effort to seize complete control, which of course they did. One of the great tragedies, if not the central great tragedy of Weimar, is that it voted itself out of existence. The very next month, the Weimar Assembly passed something referred to as the Enabling Act, which did not disband Weimar, but kept suspending it for 4 years, and they kept renewing that subsequently until the end of the Third Reich. And what it effectively enabled Adolf Hitler to do was to rule by decree. And I think that in many respects links to some of the things that Kathryn was alluding to earlier. So legitimate crisis, fake crisis, all have a direct role in this particular history and its effects today.
Yeah, and I think that brings us back to the question too of when does a crisis end? And maybe Lauren, this is something you posed, and who decides when a crisis ends? Like the refugee crisis of 2015 was, I know, used in Hungary and a lot of Central European countries as kind of a major selling point for right-wing political parties. And, you know, was that to what extent was the refugee crisis kind of fabricated in some of those places, or at least accentuated to instill fear, to kind of encourage this culture of fearing the other, and using it as a political campaign. And of course, like coronavirus is a legitimate crisis, but you know, when does it end? When does the Hungarian parliament decide, okay, well, we don't need the coronavirus law anymore? Or is it like, you know, the Weimar period where these things kind of just extend because we know this is really, this all is just the veneer of democracy anyway in a lot of places, and Poland's kind of on this path as well. So, I mean, that's a question I don't know if I have the answer to. Who decides when a crisis is over? And something like the coronavirus, where we're going to see more surges of it, maybe in the next few years.
Well, I do have the answer to that, but I can't reveal it for 15 years. So,
Yeah, I'll say one more thing about this question of kind of when a crisis ends. Germany has controlled it relatively well with a lockdown, but one thing that they did was they had to bring in the vegetables for harvest. They had to bring in the asparagus. And so because they did not want Germans to risk their lives picking asparagus, they flew in 80,000 immigrants from poorer countries, Romania and Bulgaria chiefly, and put them in kind of camps where they could pick asparagus. They're making money, you know, they're low-paid agricultural workers, but now all of the hotspots of Corona are in those farm worker camps, are in meat packing plants that are largely immigrant labor in Germany. That's the kind of the same case here. And like, if you think about something like, I don't know, like Tyson, right? A chicken processing plant. You know very well that like the CEO of Tyson will be continuing to socially distance until this is over. But that the people who are at the very bottom, who are the low-paid workers who actually slaughter the animals, are going to be sent back, kind of depending on when states decide. I mean, they're essential workers, so they're already back at work. But this question of kind of when can we go back to work, like that looks very different for different people. Again, like with Amazon, I can promise you Jeff Bezos is not going and meeting strangers right now. But that Amazon workers are being required to continue to work in close quarters. So I think that's another question about who can shelter from a crisis.
So I'll raise, that raises an interesting question that I suspect Adam has no idea, nothing to say about it, but I'll pose it anyway, which is that in the case of the Hungarian asparagus pickers, or in this country, the folks working in meat packers, they're there because of economic disparity as much as anything else. And because of their circumstances of where they have to work and so on, they are more exposed to, in this case, the virus itself. But then that can lead into, or could lead into a rhetoric of the weak forms of humanity versus strong forms of humanity, strains, races, perhaps. Adam, might you have any thoughts on that?
Sure, and again, it's a great question. And it's something that I promise I will not do, but we all could, I know, but in the connection of this particular time period, we can go on and on and on about. But what I will say about the idea of a weak population, a strong variation within, that rhetoric, unfortunately, very much played into the rhetoric of contemporary Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, and not just in non-democratic or illiberal democracies. I think one of the great consequences, and something that this is a framework, a national framework that I should say a political framework that much of the world still exists in. The Treaty of Versailles, the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Saint-Germain, etc. They all created a scenario where governments viewed their citizens and their so-called subjects in terms of populations, population politics. I know Lauren has worked with Tara Zara, and there are many others that have talked about this. But the world effectively, in the 1920s, including the United States, started to view their citizens in this very rigid racial, ethnic, national mindset. And when we take that mentality, and they did so not necessarily with any inherent malicious rationale, but that's of course what ended up happening, because when you govern a society based exclusively on who belongs and who does not, who's a full-fledged member and who is not, you then really create these very dangerous circumstances, which of course really emerge, especially in the 1930s in Europe and then elsewhere. But in the context of your question, when you already have that kind of scenario as a backdrop, it is then much easier for politicians in this case, but also strong movements, populists, etc., to say these people are weak, they are others, they bring disease, they are lazy, they don't actually do anything for the Volksgemeinschaft or whatever else you might call it, and therefore we need to weed them out either through expulsion or, in the extreme, and I'm not saying that isn't an extreme answer, but in the ultimate extreme, mass murder. And I think an example of that outside of Germany at that time period is Turkey, what we've talked about, the nation state of Turkey as it was created, and the expulsion of Greek population, so-called Greek populations, who the Turkish government said these are Greeks, even though they might not have identified as such. All right, and the same thing happens across Europe.
We are at 6:40 in Laramigo time zone. Time to sort of gracefully unwind. So maybe I'll leave as an open-ended thing if any of the three of you have had thoughts trickling in the back of your mind that didn't come out and you want to share them now as we move towards wrapping up. I told Scott we'd be done before midnight, so we do need to attend to this. So. Somebody's got to speak.
Yeah, I'll jump off of what Adam just said, which is, I mean, again, you do see these parallels today. We know that in real hotspots like New York and my own hometown of Chicago, African-American populations, Hispanic population, Latinx populations, like immigrant populations have been hit harder by the virus. And so it's been kind of worrying to see that as that's become clearer, some of our elected officials have been saying, well, it's over, right? We've controlled it. This is only hitting certain populations, so we care less. And that's been really demoralizing. And then there are these very explicit cases like in Germany where, you know, the reason that the hotspots are in these camps for these agricultural workers are because they live very close together, there's poor sanitation, there's little access to running water, right? Any of us would be more likely, anyone in the world would be more likely to get corona under those conditions. And so it's important to think about, what are we stigmatizing here? And what we should be stigmatizing is poor housing conditions, right? And then one other thing is, I think that it's been interesting to see too, kind of crisis is deployed. And we're obviously in a crisis, there's no doubt about that, but it's been interesting to see how it's deployed to things that are obviously trying to go and like attack what we're facing, which is this virus, and then this coming and extant unemployment crisis that is leading to all kinds of crises. And then just the language of crisis kind of allows these acts. So like I know Orban, one of his first acts was to say, okay, under the Corona Act, I'm going to make it illegal for transgender people to change their gender. That's not creating disease, you know? Why are you doing this? I think that it's important to kind of look at what our leaders do in moments of crisis and say, well, what are you linking? And what do we actually need you to do? You know, I don't think that Trump's immigration ban right now that has exemptions for agricultural workers, because we really do like having vegetables on our plates. We have more cases of corona than anyone else in the world, right? Why? We should have an immigration ban if we're being honest with ourselves. And so I think it's important to kind of see what is crisis enabling that exceeds what's actually necessary. And that's an important question for us to ask, maybe as citizens.
Yeah, and I think to kind of push public history here and thinking about memory, that's why these conversations are so important, that we need to pay attention to the historical narrative. And those of us who have the privilege often to shelter and to not be as affected by these crises also have the privilege not to think about history as much. We, of course, do as historians, but I was reading a Native author recently, Tommy Orange, and in his interlude, he writes something about how, you know, Black and Brown Indigenous populations don't have the privilege of not thinking about history. It's just part of their identity. And I mean, maybe, I'm sure there's some different experiences, but I think that people with a lot of privilege in the societies that we're talking about, not just Hungary, not just the United States, but probably across the globe, really need to think about history and need to have these discussions so that we can pay attention to a law that is about public health that's affecting transgendered people, or populations of the Roma people who really don't have a voice for themselves as much, just being kind of cordoned off. And if they die, well, you know, I mean, that seems to be the rhetoric, which I find really troubling in a lot of places. So yeah, we need to pay attention to these things.
Yeah. Adam?
Full agreement, and I hope this is actually acceptable in this venue, but this question, and I think the overarching conversation, led to an area where I thought we might get. I've been spending the last couple of days really thinking about this topic, generally speaking. And the last few days, I was reminded of, I think, one of the more powerful things I've ever read. This book on Weimar Germany came out originally in 2007. And I say that here because I think it's important to understand that this is not something that was written with a direct intent to strike people today. But if everyone's okay with it, I just want to read just that short paragraph, and it's not long because I think this addresses it. So from Weimar Germany, Promise and Tragedy. Weimar reminds us that democracy is a fragile thing, society an unstable construction, each threatening to spin wildly out of control. It shows us the dangers that can develop when there is no societal consensus on any of the fundamental issues of politics, social order, and culture. Democracy can be fertile soil for all sorts of interesting debates and for the effervescence of the cultural spirit. But when virtually every debate becomes a live or die question about the essential features of human existence, from the intimacy of the bedroom to the structure of the business world, when every issue is seen to carry earth-shattering significance, when there is no overarching system of belief to which most people give their loyalty, a democracy cannot long endure. And it especially cannot endure when powerful groups in that society seek at every turn to undermine and destroy its very being. The threats to democracy are not always from enemies abroad. They can come from those within who espouse the language of democracy and use the liberties afforded by democratic institutions to undermine the substance of democracy. Weimar cautions us to be wary of those people as well. What comes next can be very bad, even worse than imaginable. And that last line in particular, I think, is something that we need to think about in this context of crisis, how these forces use these issues, and the lessons of everything that we've discussed, the historical lessons of everything we've discussed today.
And on that cheery note, it was very that was a great piece to read, Adam, and I thank you for that. And I'll move into wrapping up now. We're past 6:45 Laramigo time. Thank you, all three of you, very much again for spending this time. It was a wonderful conversation. I had the pleasure to sit and listen to the three of you for the most part, and I enjoyed it very much. I will take off on something that various of you raised, which is that things like, for example, the coronavirus currently was declared to be unpredictable, and how could we know it was coming by some of the people who are perhaps exploiting it for their own advantage. Whereas, as was said, the Centers for Disease Control had been warning us about this for 10 years. Well, a plug, 2 weeks hence, our two panelists, one of them is David Quammen, whose 2012 book, Spillover, he's a science writer, was very clear about the fact that we're going to be heading into a coronavirus. And David, his wife Betsy, is, of all things, she's a historian. I know. But she has written a book recently about Clive and Bundy and God and how their religious beliefs and how that fits into everything. And the two of them are going to be our panelists 2 weeks hence, and they're going to meld together their writings and focus in on the current moment. So thank you again, all three of you. It's been a dear pleasure to spend this time with you. And I look forward to having another immigrant to the Rocky Mountain West sometime this summer. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.